Whole Foods every Sunday. It's like $8.50. If you get there past 9:30, it's like a nightmare. So.
Team, you have a phone call, parked on 6000. Team member in meet 6000.
Say hi.
Hi.
9 degrees out.
Very cool.
Mostly just Whole Foods, organic, pasture-raised, grass-fed type stuff, but we do indulge every once in a while. For example, a lot of meats, proteins, fruits, heavy on the carbs. I also already hit the gym this morning, so free Sunday, which is super nice. Not doing too much work today. So last time we were talking about more of the mindset and the background and the information from a skill set standpoint of what you need to start a company. There's so much more that you need than just what I talked about or mentioned last time. That's kind of the foundation, and wanted to get more into the details, the weeds about what we did to get to where we are today. And a lot of that started with, once we finished up doing the research and vetting the idea, spending hundreds of hours on the research process and learning about how to be managers of a business, learning about marketing and sales and finance. The first thing that we did, and really the most fun part, was the development of the process of the actual beverage. The beginning stages were fun. The more nitty-gritty manufacturing R&D was not, for various reasons that I'll talk about in probably the next episode or two. The biggest thing that we did that was fun, designing the product. What we did to start was just taking a blank sheet of computer paper and drawing. Just buying a bunch of alcohol and juices and other beverages on the market already, to understand the taste preferences that we liked and narrowing it down to a population size that we could then bring to friends and family to taste and to give their opinions on as well. So from a design standpoint, it took many different shapes and we iterated a bunch on the idea. For the most part, it was just a variation, or there were variations of one product that we had in our mind that we loved. And I'll talk about that more when we can actually publicly talk about our products after we launch. We did all that, and then while we were designing it, we hired a formal creative studio out in LA when the time came that we needed to finalize or formalize a design and the branding and the logo and all that sort of stuff. At the same time, we did the on-the-market product testing or tasting. And so we had like a bunch of friends over one time, and we bought the popular stuff, we bought products that we liked, we bought products with flavors that we wanted to get into or consider for our own beverage. The type form, like app, survey, ended up being anonymous We just poured a bunch of these beverages into little plastic cups and asked them, alcohol content and strength, flavor, sweetness, mouthfeel, smell, all those sorts of things, and got a bunch of great insightful pieces of feedback, and one that really stuck that I'll talk about once we launch that drove our entire strategy and outlook for our brand and how we would approach the market. But that was such a huge and crucial part of the process for us to understand what we wanted to build. And on top of that, what people wanted us to build, right? Because being so close to it, we have certain biases that we can't really separate ourselves from. And to have a successful business, you can't really just listen to yourself. You have to listen to what the future buyers and consumers of the product say and want. For example, right, I love grapefruit as a flavor. Not many people do. And so if I liked that as a flavor and brought it to market, it would probably flop relative to other flavors that we could have introduced into the market because of consumers that are actually buying this stuff that have preferences. So that was a huge part. The pre-market testing, having other people vet our concepts is really, really important for us. From there, it was about taking the feedback and combining it with our own ideas and seeing where there was alignment and where it matched and where it didn't, and understanding what the disconnects were, and taking all of that and kind of putting it towards a final idea to then create. We had a couple different flavor ideas and flavor profile concepts, and we ended up hiring a lab to help create it, right? Bring it to life. Because I certainly have no business, creating it in my kitchen. I am not a scientist and don't know the first thing about any of that stuff in formulation. So we hired a lab. They were based out in California, in LA. Over a period of 6 months, went through, had some samples sent to us. We iterate a little bit, and then ended up flying out to California to be in their lab with them so that we could fine tune and modify in real time on the spot or on site so that it wasn't drawing out the process even longer. The problem that we faced with them was that they had said creating our idea wasn't possible, which we didn't like to hear, one, and two, didn't believe to be true. So we parted ways from them. We own the IP, so we didn't have any issues with that. And IP is just intellectual property. It's an asset class for businesses, something that you'll read about in self-help books if you ever decide to start a business. We own the IP and took it to a new lab after interviewing a handful of new labs or other labs, and went with one. And from the start, they were great. They liked to do everything virtually, which was fine. It was a cost savings to us, which was helpful at that point in time because we didn't have a lot of money. It was pre-fundraise. And then from there, it became a 6 to 8 month, 10 month process where we iterated a bunch. They sent us samples. And then at a certain point, we came to the decision that we had a final formula. We took what they created, which we were super happy with. So we ended up finding out that it was a possibility to create our product. So those other guys can pound sand. Created this product. It was great. We loved it. And then had to take it to a sample production lab so that we could have samples to start the conversations of raising capital from investors. I won't talk about that today. It'll be a different episode because that's a whole other beast. But had these samples, this lab made up. It was probably close to 200 samples of each flavor, and there was a ton of shipping issues for some reason. Once we got over that hurdle, we received the samples and realized that there was pulp in the samples, like orange juice pulp. orange juice is not at all related to our product. It was a different kind of pulp, but just as an example, there was pulp. And that wasn't supposed to be the case. The samples that we tasted didn't have any pulp in them. So we were super confused and pretty pissed off that this was the case. Called the lab that made the samples, and they said, we just followed the formula that you gave us to the T. So we then went back to the guys that created the formula. Ultimately, through a long few weeks in understanding what the problem was, it was that these guys that created the formula were cutting corners and sent samples that didn't match the formula spec sheet. And so when we received the spec sheet, the final formula spec sheet, to then give to this other lab that made the samples, it wasn't what we had tasted exactly. There was one ingredient that was off. Went up the chain to the managers and VPs of this group, and ultimately they gave us future credit towards ingredient purchases for this particular ingredient, as opposed to comping our entire sample that costed us thousands of dollars, which was bullshit. I made an even bigger stink after that, but ultimately it was an issue. I guess one of the guys that was working there had done this before, so they ended up firing him, which I feel bad about, but I also kind of don't, because it's just bad work product and bad quality control. But nonetheless, we were in this position and we had these samples that had pulp that shouldn't have had pulp. We didn't have enough money to redo the sampling process, so we had to use these samples that had the pulp and then start the fundraising process to raise money from investors. We didn't have the time to continue to delay and wait 2, 3, 4 months to refigure this out and to make new samples, etc. So we had to just caveat to investors when we were pitching them that the taste will be the same as it is in the future as you're tasting it today. It just won't have any pulp. We went from there and raised capital, albeit it was a very tough market to raise money in. So that was a separate challenge. Again, I'll talk about that in future episodes. But yeah, that was sort of the next step in the process, and took about a year between that first sampling with friends and getting samples to then go to investors with. Depending on the industry, what I'll say is that the process takes a lot longer to start a company than you probably think, and just be prepared to want to have the savings to start it. Don't leave your job yet. Stay working full-time, or at the very least part-time, because you're going to need cash. You're going to need to reinvest in the business. Things will happen that don't go to plan. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong, is the truth, and you need to weather the storm. So just make sure you have that foresight. It took us about 2 years longer to launch than what we initially expected because of various delays, manufacturing issues, R&D issues that I talked about, having trouble raising capital because of the market conditions. Just make sure you have a plan and make sure that you expect issues to arise and that you have the money to weather those delays and issues. It's just a long process. Be ready for it.